Around December each year, I've started an annual tradition of playing through Bloodborne. It was in the winter of 2020 when I finally decided to play Bloodborne with a simple conviction. I wasn't going to stop until I understood what it was that everyone liked about the game so much. In hindsight, it's incredible that I had gotten so far without spoiling the game for myself, which I suppose is one of the great things about the Souls-borne community. I had given Bloodborne a shot when it came out, and I still remember finding and picking it up for $20 on Black Friday. I remember really wanting to like it, but I also remembered not having fun. Not being familiar with the Dark Souls series, I booted up Bloodborne for the first time and immediately was invested. The world and atmosphere was grim and mysterious, the aesthetics were well crafted, and I wanted to understand why the hunt was happening and what my role in it was. But the odds were stacked against me. Playing it on the original PS4, I eventually stopped because I was getting frustrated. Not frustrated with dying a lot, I knew enough about the Dark Souls series to know that lots of dying was in my future. The source of my frustration was the loading times. I'm a fan of playing fighting games, and I understand and enjoy the thought of attempting something, gathering information, and trying again. But the load times on the PS4 felt like I was being punished for something that I had to do in order to play the game. I would make a mistake, trying to learn how to navigate a boss fight, an enemy, or a map section, and inevitably die. Then have to wait for what felt like minutes for the game to load, only to make a different mistake somewhere else, or worse, the same mistake in the same place, die, and have to wait another eternity to start playing again. I tried to play it again at some point, but quickly ran into the same wall, which resulted in the same outcome. However, having gotten a PS5, and having Bloodborne be a part of the collection of free games offered with PlayStation Plus, I decided this was the time I would finally tackle Bloodborne. The solid-state drive and upscaling from PS4 meant that the game's load times were significantly lower, which was much more friendly while you recover from being annihilated. However, I quickly find myself encountering a different issue that had taken a back seat due to the load times. I didn't understand how to properly approach combat. Well, I'm sure at this point it's an old song and dance, the hurdle of understanding combat was my next challenge. There were properties to attacks and actions that aren't explicitly communicated that you eventually figure out through someone telling you or experimentation. But I kept at it, and I had a nagging feeling that there was a gap in my information. This was eventually confirmed when I found out I had inadvertently missed the tutorial message in the Hunter's Dream about firearms, and missing this message led me down a path of misconception. I remember playing and thinking that the firearm was for, being a firearm, dismantling groups of enemies from a relative distance. I had chosen the blunderbuss as my starting firearm, but I found that it was incredibly weak, even at short range, and didn't seem to be very useful. I would use a ton of bullets, only to do a negligible amount of damage compared to my melee weapon, so naturally I thought the gun was useless, until I eventually took a step back and found myself wondering, why am I able to wield a gun and a melee weapon at the same time if it is indeed useless? There must be something that I'm missing with the firearms, and this led me down the path of experimentation. Trying to use it to cover gaps in my melee strings didn't seem to work, as the shot from the blunderbuss had a much longer recovery than my melee attacks. However, it also had more hit stun, which in some cases made it possible for me to fire and be able to get some melee hits in before needing to back off and recover stamina. This got me far enough in the game that I encountered the cleric beast, which I dispatched relatively easily by just staying around its back and repeatedly mashing melee attack. From here, I was able to slowly make my way to the next boss with a feeling that I was finally understanding the game. But Father Gascon proved that I was wrong. I was vastly underprepared, and as such I hit my next wall of confusion and frustration. I still felt like I was missing something, even as I was discovering more about the combat mechanics. I realized that the dodge had invincibility frames, which meant a well-timed dodge was more valuable than a preemptive one, but this discovery brought me back to my firearm once again feeling useless. If I can dodge the attacks and punish with my melee weapon, what purpose does this incredibly weak and slow blunderbuss serve? Holding this thought at the front of my mind, I kept experimenting around Yharnam, mainly because the titan that was Father Gascon stood as an insurmountable obstacle to the rest of the game. Eventually I started to think maybe the threaded cane was the wrong choice, maybe the blunderbuss was the wrong choice as well. Maybe I picked the worst possible loadout and should start over. Still, practicing and trying to figure out the proper time to roll and strike, I kept trying to incorporate the blunderbuss to try and figure out what it was used for. And then, in a panicked melee against multiple enemies, I found it. I didn't even know what was happening. I just heard a booming audio cue and saw the enemy recoil and stagger in a way I hadn't seen before, dropping to one knee and opening their arms as if to welcome the carnage I could inflict. I recognized that they seemed to be winding up for an attack when it happened, so I tried to recreate the situation. After a few attempts, I got another stagger. I approached them to attack and discovered the incredible strength of the visceral attack, whose force reverberated and cleared the fog surrounding Bloodborne in my mind. When this final piece fell into place, I could finally see the wonderful blank canvas that is Soulsborne combat. Suddenly, everything made sense. Dodging wasn't just a means of creating or closing space, and firearms were a means of interrupting and parrying attacks. Armed with this knowledge, I was able to eventually defeat Gascon and experience the twists and turns of the rest of the game, which fully solidified Bloodborne as one of, if not my favorite game. I'd been indoctrinated. I went through the same cycle that you hear every time someone talks about the Souls games. It wasn't very fun at first, very slow, with lots of time spent being defensive. Then one day they discover how free-form the combat can be, and suddenly they're one of the insufferable fans of Souls-like games screeching "get good" and taking pleasure in the suffering of players that haven't had the enlightening that they've experienced. I'm kidding, of course. But there is a huge amount of catharsis in finally solving the puzzle that is combat in From Software games. I now understood how to use each of the tools at my disposal, and now any challenge or death I encountered was 100% a learning experience. Gaining this understanding of the game mechanics not only helped me uncover a game I now actively want to revisit annually, but it also opened the path into other From Software games. Games like Sekiro and Elden Ring, games that I 100% would not have considered playing had I not unlocked the potential of Bloodborne. Not to sound too dramatic, but finally getting it with Bloodborne completely changed my mindset when encountering difficulty in games. It shifted my mindset from thinking, this is impossible, toward, if I can gather enough information, I can figure out a path forward. And I don't know about you, but for me, life has been much more interesting armed with the mindset that anything is possible. That every failure is a lesson in what not to do. And the only way you can truly fail is if you stop trying to succeed.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.